What are we doing?
That looks more like a TV show, no?
Like a TV show?
Oh.
Aren't we in a TV show?
We are in
Yeah?
a way in a TV show, but we're talking about video games, I guess, right?
We are talking about video games, or we are talking about the stories?
Good question. Good question. I think stories are a very good part of what video games mean today.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't forget about other forms of entertainment, right? About movies, cinema, TV shows, literature, of course.
So don't you think, Ivan, that when a story is good, when a story sucks you in, it doesn't matter if it's a movie?
It actually works in very different media, and all together. Now, especially now, we're living in a moment where all those media are converging in a way, and we see more and more video game titles, intellectual properties going to the movies or to the TV shows, the other way around as well. And we wanted to talk about that, right?
Yeah, we want to talk about transmedia stories. And for that, we have, who we have?
So we have a Hollywood director, very successful Hollywood director, Jordan Vogt-Roberts, that is the the director of Kong, for instance, a big hit in the movie business, that is now directing, is working on a movie of a very well-known intellectual property in the games industry, that is Metal Gear Solid. Okay, we have his experience here, along with another two very powerful women, two rock stars of the games industry.
Yeah, they are so power. One of them is Kiki Wolfkill, the woman behind Halo.
Yeah, it's like the woman behind the Halo universe, right?
Yeah.
Now working in the production of a TV show of the Halo property.
So it's true that Kiki used to be a pilot racer.
Yeah, she was a little bit of everything.
Pilot.
She's super special and super brave, and she started as a racer, but he's now doing a lot of other riskful things in the games industry, in the media industry.
And then of course we have the great Amy Hennig, one of the best writers in the industry.
Yeah, I would say one of the best writers and creative directors in our industry. And Amy is now working for Skydance Media as a president of the Skydance Media new media division. And she's trying to take us to the next level, to the next stage of interactive storytelling from them. So I think the conversation between them is quite unique, quite interesting, and to get them through the, all those topics. We have
don't forget
someone
about
else. We have Raúl Rubio, who is the co-founder and the creative director of a very innovative indie game studio called Kiloworks, always trying to innovate in the narratives, in the way of telling stories, and is now trying to get the most out of these three amazing guests that we have today.
So, are we ready for this?
I think they're ready. I think they're ready. Let's see.
Where are they? I'm very interested to know where.
Well, Jordan is in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Kiki is in Seattle, and Amy is very close to San Francisco in San Carlos. I was having lunch with her not long time ago there. It means it looks like
you are traveling all the time.
I used to travel. I don't know.
You must be exhausted.
Yeah, now it's time for resting. But let's say hi to all of them. Raúl in Madrid, Amy in San Carlos, Kiki in Seattle, as I said, and Jordan in Los Angeles. Hello all. How are you guys doing?
Okay.
Beautiful. You all look great. I mean, those are amazing settings. And even though I would prefer to have you all here with us in Barcelona, we are so happy and so honored to have you from your house, from your home, from your offices. We feel honored that you let us get into a little bit of your privacy. Raúl, you have many questions. You know a lot of storytelling. You are a great creative director. But these people that you have in the panel today, I think we all could learn a lot from them. Could you lead us through the conversation, please?
Definitely. I mean, hi from cyberspace, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I mean, I could say that it's an orgasmic pleasure to be in front of these three giants and titans.
Good morning.
Okay. Good morning.
I'm glad the bottom of the screen is cut off there.
Anyway, it's true that basically the three of you are coming from different backgrounds, and for me, the reason, well, I had no idea I was going to be a creative director one day. I never planned to be in the video games industry. For me, in fact, storytelling, when I was a kid, it was more like adventure books, like Robert Louis Stevenson, for example, or Jules Verne. But then my parents, they had the Disney Imagineers encyclopedia, and basically I learned about the Imagineers and how basically they could turn a location into a story, and how basically they could hint events that never happened with characters that never existed. And that's when I decided I was going to be a comic book artist. That never happened, of course, thanks to two things. One, Eric Shahi and Another World, Out of This World in the US, which was the reason I started to make games in the first place. And basically how in that game, which uses narrative with no dialogue, the action is driving the story, but at the same time, you are always hanging for that story, so you are hooked, and basically creates a loop where literally you cannot stop until the ending. And it was the first example where I saw that that was interactive. Right? And then John Carmack, a few months later, he said that regarding Doom, that the story in a game, it was like a story in a porn movie. It was something expected but not necessary. And basically, that was the reason when I said, no, that's not true, because I played Another World. And that's the reason why in Tequila Wars we always try to make things with gusto, but at the same time we are trying to find the beautiful and the crazy, and that balance, which is not very easy, because in the end, it's not just an artistic choice. It's more like how as your interpretation of storytelling and narrative, right? I mean, traditionally, and this is more about you and your background. Traditionally, video games, they have always have this inferiority complex when they have looked for other mediums for reference models, especially Hollywood, for example, in the 90s, and probably, I mean, John Carmack has amended that quote several times. He was talking about gameplay, and gameplay is king, etc., etc. But it's true that we have gone a long way, and what better way of knowing this way than why you're interested in narrative, why you started, I mean, how you fell in love with narrative or storytelling, and how that affected your field. I mean, Amy, how games changed your life? Tell me from the beginning.
From the very beginning. Well, I'm probably the oldest one here, so it started with Pong, and I was probably 11 years old or so. I'm trying to remember, but you know, I was one of those kids that, you know, wanted to go to the arcade every weekend, and whatever I had made for my allowance, I spent in quarters. But at that point, it was pretty nascent. It was Pong and Seawolf and Night Driver, and but it already sparked the imagination. And then in 1977, the Atari 2600 came out, and my parents, bless them, even though I don't know that we could afford it, they got us one for Christmas, and that changed my life forever. And so I was always a gamer, but I also that same year discovered two other things that all kind of collided at one point of time, and one of those was Star Wars, which of course blew all of our minds and changed the landscape, creative landscape for everybody, and the other one was Dungeons & Dragons. So I was also that kind of gamer. Had the original basic set back in '77 and played for many years. But I didn't really come back to it all until my adult life. After I studied English literature and went to film school and thought that I was going to be a writer or a filmmaker, and then stumbled backwards into games again, and then sort of found that was the frontier in the blue ocean that I wanted to explore.
Because originally you were, correct me if I'm wrong, Kiki, but you have an artistic background. You were a director, but then you had this executive talent for production. So how you balance those two things? I mean, right now you are heading transmedia and entertainment, and we will talk about that later. But how it was for you?
Yeah, I mean, I started in games, in art. I actually started in video and cinematic production. Coming out of school, I wanted to be a documentary filmmaker, and I needed money, and I fell into a job digitizing video when it was a dark art, and started doing it for games. And so I'd always been a gamer. I'd always played. I always had a voracious appetite for sort of sprawling novels and adventure stories and really world building, like immersion and escapism was something that sort of had always been part of my childhood. And so when I started to do work in games, I was sort of immediately captivated by the creative challenge of working under really crazy constraints from an art perspective, right? This was early in the PC pre-Xbox days. And I think for me, what I brought forward from sort of school and all of the things I'd studied is I had this deep interest in like comparative literature and art history and how worlds are sort of expressed, particularly through visuals. And so getting into game art was super interesting for me because it is about how you tell story with really limited tools. And I think part of me as well, because I love storytelling, art was a way of getting more story into some of the things I worked on that frankly were not very narrative driven. And I have the weird brain that can sit on the creative side and also speak the language of production and sort of creatively problem solve to get to the intent of an idea versus the exact execution of what the original idea may have been, which is, I think, what has allowed me to sort of transition from art into more of a leadership role. Because, with games, it's a balance. Right? It's all about reaching the intent through any number of different means. But yeah, for me, I've always been a visual storyteller. I love creating worlds and experiences, and the visual medium is the way I've sort of learned how to do that.
Cool. And well, Jordan, you are a breathtaking filmmaker, and of course, you have been touched by video games in more than one way. And actually, you are a great fan of video games. But from movies like, I don't know, The Kings of Summer or Kong, Skull Island, you have the responsibility of the live action adaptation to the big screen of Metal Gear Solid, no less. So how it was for you? I mean, obviously in Hollywood they say that the story is everything, but how it was for you at the beginning?
Well, I wish that your introduction of me stopped just at you're breathtaking instead of you're breathtaking.
We were all thinking, Jordan.
I would have blushed. It's funny, Amy's story starts with Pong, and mine starts with Kong, I suppose. But honestly, I'm kind of a fusion of the two of them because I grew up playing video games and I'm probably the youngest one here, even though my wizard beard may make people think I'm an old man. But I was part of what I think is a very specific generation of kids who grew up on video games, had their brains blown open and blasted by them, much in the same way Star Wars did to a generation. But I was part of the first wave of kids growing up on video games who didn't have purchasing power. So what I played, what I was allowed to play, what was brought home was entirely dependent on what my parents would allow me to buy or what they were willing to spend. So that sort of made video games even more mythical because it were these things out of reach. You know, I could still go and renting a movie was one thing. Getting a Genesis or an SNES or, something like that was a much greater challenge. So the fact that the lack of purchasing power sort of created this like even larger mythos in my mind. And like truly, everyone here sort of has had a roundabout way into this, but I always joke that if I was smarter and if the tools to make video games were more accessible when I was younger, I would have gone into video games. Like it is strange because I went and then did one of the more insane and equally difficult and brutal industries in order to kind of roundabout come back to being involved in video games. And that's not just with adaptations and like helping shepherd these things to the screen. Metal Gear is one of many game projects that I'm working on, but I'm also involved in many sort of game commercials as I watch sometimes the speak of like ad agencies and game developers completely break down, and I'm able to go in and speak to the game developers and show them like my love of what these things are and tap into what is important, what do they want the player to feel when they play their game, and how do I translate that to the screen. So my process was very roundabout, and kind of with, like Kiki was saying, I actually thought I was going to make documentaries at first. And that turned to comedy, and then that turned to sort of action comedy. And now I feel very fortunate that has allowed me to really, I think, become even more like open and honest about like my passion and my love of games. But part of that now is that I have a bit of power to help start rewriting the narrative of how games and cinema coexist. And, yes, story is hypothetically king. I mean, first of all, character is ideally king in film. But I think that, as Kiki was saying, when you have limitations in game assets and art, it forces you to sort of to force in backstory and lore and things there. And in film, I think there's a lot that we can learn from games. During the press tour of Kong, I was very vocal that a lot of my influences were video games. And press people would come up to me and say, you really shouldn't say that. You shouldn't mention video games like that. Like that's kind of like a no-no thing. And I was like, no, I want to rewrite this narrative because video games are important to me. And eventually, there already are really interesting video games movies that kind of aren't based on video games, like Edge of Tomorrow or Snowpiercer, oddly enough, are like very video gamey. But yes, I had like an equally sort of roundabout process where if I was better at math, I probably would have just gotten into video games to begin with. But now I'm able to, as Amy was saying, Star Wars also blew my brain open. And so I sort of have these two like competing loves in my life. And for me, I'm very curious on the film narrative side, how to like properly translate and fuse those and to collaborate with people that I'm fortunate to know, like now yourself, but Amy and Kiki, who I respect so dearly as creators and as people. But also then how can, like when you mention Star Wars, one thing that I think is really important is like, we've been living in the imagination of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg for 40 years, truly. That's probably the most seminal work of original fiction written ever after Lord of the Rings, and everything, and that's so Campbellian, and that is so sort of archetypical, and we've literally been living in the echo and the shadow, and people trying to figure out how do we make a new Goonies, or how do we make a new Indiana Jones. And the thing that I love about video games that Hollywood needs to really sort of like take cues from is stepping away from that exact style of storytelling and that exact style of like narrative structuring or like the hero's journey in ways to sort of like present new experiences to audiences. And so I think there's a lot to learn on both sides. And I just happen to be this like maybe jack of no trades that I'm able to fall directly in the middle and interface with lovely people on both sides.
One of the things I will jump in and say, conversations that Jordan and I have had in the past, sometimes with alcohol, sometimes with not. One of the things that's amazing about Jordan is he's a filmmaker with such a deep respect and passion and understanding for video games that it's incredible to sort of talk through really what video game adaptations, translations, etc. could look like, because he has a core intuitive understanding of why games work for players. And so it's always such an intriguing conversation and always enlightening for me as I learn the other side of the equation. So just a shout out to Jordan.
Well, because thank you. Because there's a translation process, right? Like you can't go from an active experience of playing a game and having an amazing iconic character like Link, who is essentially a silent protagonist, where you become that player, to the passive experience of watching a movie where you generally need your protagonist to speak. Well, although if I ever made a Zelda movie, I would have Link not speak and have it be insane. But there is a natural translation that happens, and a lot of people, I think, truly have misunderstood. They look at video game IPs and they just say, "Oh, look at this guy in this awesome green armor." When they're talking about Halo, or look at this, like, Uncharted. It's just like it's this crazy nonstop action, and in a sense, like, a lot of contemporary, very pre-vised modern action movies kind of feel like the bad version of Uncharted, where it's these like sequences that just build and build and build and build. And when you're playing that as Nathan Drake and as Amy designed it, it's incredible because you're in the middle of it. But when you're watching, in episode 1, famously, it's like you're in a submarine and they get eaten by like a fish, and then, oh my God, and then a bigger fish eats that fish, and then, oh my God, and then a bigger fish eats that fish. And like, I get it, there's always a bigger fish, but you're not invested in the same way. And because I was that kid growing up, my brain was truly rewired by video games and film at the same time in an interesting way, where like my DNA is just as much games as it is film. And I really love bringing some of the logic and the style and the kinetics and the types of storytelling. And I know that there's a handful of other directors, Duncan Jones and Dan Trachtenberg, and, a lot of really cool cats coming up right now that, like I happen to be one of the youngest people kind of operating at the level that I operate at, so who grew up on games, who had games change me, and I think that's going to be part of the equation of how games change in Hollywood, in the same way, like it took Sam Raimi coming in who loved Spider-Man and was changed by like comic books. But it's still going to take a minute, because up until then it's been people who have no like emotional core reaction, or have not had like the fear or the dread of sneaking into a base in Metal Gear, or the sense of like Miyamoto wonder of wandering fields in Zelda, or truly in Halo, like what it is to like have your shield powered down and in the last second do your melee attack and knock out 3 guys so quick, and the visceral thrill you get from that. And so they see the pieces of IP. Oh, here's a world and here's a story we can tell with these characters and this, but they don't understand those feelings and what that made you feel, and therefore how you translate that stuff. So there's a wave of us coming, but it's going to be a second.
Yeah, but it's fascinating because that's why I think this topic is interesting. Is for older folks like me, we were homaging and making a love letter to adventure cinema, right? And we're sort of homaging the stuff that inspired us, whether that's Star Wars or Indiana Jones or whatever from our childhoods, and pulling all this cinematic language into interactive. And then a generation later, you've got people like you. Yes, I played Pong and Adventure on the Atari 2600, but I wouldn't say they shaped me other than seeing the possibility of this future medium.
Right.
But then you got people like you who their Star Wars or their Indiana Jones were games, which wasn't possible before. And so we've got this great dialogue now where we're going to be building on each other's ideas, I think, in this cool improvisational way, this conversation through media that really is only just starting to happen.
Yeah. And I would add to that.
Go ahead.
Oh, just what also then is the next step, because that's conversations I think the three of us have all had, which is there's sort of reconciling language and how do we bring games to film and vice versa. And then there's, well, what's next for narrative and how people experience story, which is, I think, the conversations I love having with both of you.
Yeah, and, to put a button on that, from what both of you had just said, but, Amy, when you talk about, we were homaging these things and it became this other thing, in the same way, Lucas was homaging Flash Gordon and these serials,
yes.
And then he created something greater than that in the process, right? Mm-hmm. And whatever when LucasArts and the stuff Tim Schafer was making, whatever his references were, whatever your early references were, Kojima-san, when he's referencing American machismo in those movies, it's then being filtered through his beautiful Japanese brain and then creating something far different than what that original homage is. And, and so I think something like that translation process and the way that it gets ingested and spit through our own supercomputers that sit between our ears, that's really important. And when you lack other references, then you just end up kind of creating these carbon copies of carbon copies of carbon copies, as opposed to these things that feel explosive and new. Because I think more than ever, we live in a time where it's not that film is less meaningful, and it's not that it's just everything is on demand. And so our brains treat everything as though it's like Apple Music, where you can go and you click this thing, and instead of getting a CD, you click it and you play it, and then you forget about it. Games are a little different because you do spend 30 hours with it, but it's easy for things to just kind of feel disposable, and you do it and you move on. And so I think we have to work extra hard now in order to create experiences that feel disruptive and fresh and unique and challenge audiences' expectations on narrative, on visuals, on the types of characters. And a big part of that is through translating, all of these sort of original influences from things outside of games and outside of film. And, the women above me are two of the best people in the business to do that.
Yeah, in a sense, that's quite the challenge, because in a sense, basically, as the boundaries and the original limits of each media or its medium start converging and they start influencing each other and transforming the language, that also transforms the audiences. I mean, literally, you mentioned earlier, generation change, and now the journey is not in some topic with some excuse for, I don't know, saving the princess, but in fact, it's about the size performer. It's more like you don't want to be told the story. You want to live an experience. Another challenge, video games, which is always between action and story. We have designers, we have writers.
Raúl, we are not listening to Raúl, right?
Basically,
yeah,
broken up.
Yeah. Raúl, we cannot. Your Wi-Fi is playing a trick on us on you.
We call it the free delay.
Raúl.
I think he's AI. This is recording.
This is the magic of life, but I can always call Raúl and tell him.
He's on a roll, though.
I know. He's like, you're all idiots.
It's pre-recorded simulation shit. Like we're like,
Yeah,
hey.
media hora. Okay, don't worry, because since we are recording, Raúl, can you hear me? Raúl?
And now you froze.
Oh,
Hold on a second.
I got the gist of the first part, though, I think.
I think so.
That's a classic picture right there.
Did you get the question at all? Okay, he's going to connect.
I didn't
Sort
get the
of.
final question.
Okay.
Not the final part, but it seemed like at the top, we were getting every fifth word, I think, but it seemed like, and it's something I was talking to some other folks about just yesterday, is sort of this tension between authorship and agency, and where the right balance is how I would interpret what he was saying about the experience of inhabiting a character and having that experience yourself, and having the sort of the tactile, tangible, emotional experience of inhabiting the story versus the privileged observer, passive experience of watching a film or a TV show. And how we get it wrong if we veer too much toward aping linear media, right? Because then we're not actually taking advantage of our medium. On the other hand, we have a long tradition of storytelling principles as human beings. We're wired for story, right? And I think story implies intent and authorship to some degree. So the question is, how do we fall on that spectrum where we are confidently taking our players on a journey that feels meaningful and deliberate, and not just sort of intent, and they sort of endings that are beautifully inevitable and surprising at the same time. So how do we do that but allow them to feel the story, right? And feel enough agency within that they're getting a different experience than if they just watched a film, right? That's fundamentally the tension, right?
Well, I mean, you mentioned journey, and that leads me.
And that's a great
naturally.
example of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that leads me to like my favorite, not just video games, but I tell people it's like one of my favorite media experiences in the last 2 decades, because Journey perfectly is this fusion of people arguing, well, should something be pure gameplay or should it be narrative? And Genova Chen and Robin and Austin and Kelly and like everyone that was a part of that team, they crafted something that in the most abstract way feels like just gameplay, where you're not being guided. And yet when I talk about eliciting the feelings of like, what does a game elicit from you as a player? The brilliance of that game is that what it elicits from you is the story of life, the journey of life. What it elicits from you is a perfect distilled abstract representation of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, without trying to give you any particular plot. And so I'm obsessed with that game. I've befriended Genova and like Robin as a dear friend of mine as well, and Austin the composer, and like I really have made it a goal of mine to track down every kind of like person on that team, because I think it's a seminal thing that
it is,
that because the flip side to it, when you talk about just sort of constant evolutions, as I said before, yes, we like Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Back to the Future, all these things. They're what shaped me. They're what made me who I am. But part of the problem the film industry is in right now is that we are still to this day just trying to like put better coats of paint on that same like imaginative bubble that Lucas and those guys created back in the day. There hasn't been, every once in a while, really disruptive things will come about. But for the most part, we're still painting on the same canvas, just with different tools. And Journey to me represents such an interesting thing. I remember as a kid, I would get so upset at reading like a GamePro or Nintendo Power or EGM or whatever when I'd see a quote from Miyamoto or someone saying, "Oh, games in the future, we want them to be these really tight, like 3 to 4 hour experiences." And I would be like, I'd throw the magazine in the corner and say, "No, I want to play my 80-hour RPG." You know, because you have all the time in the world, you're a kid. But Journey and Inside and these shorter games with that still have even as abstract as they are, they still have a narrative. And even if the narrative isn't that front and center, you know, you talk about the art design and the art direction, that in itself guiding you and taking you on a narrative journey as you progress from level to level and place to place. And so to me, that ends up being one of those super interesting fusions that starts breaking that mold and starts like blurring that line between, instead of warring and saying, no, this just has to be about gameplay, or no, this just is about story, you know, and also, you know, there are a lot of games that have incredible stories, but then also have these super long, just like grinding, hack and slash, stretching it out, fetch quests, all of that.
The air goes out of the experience, yeah.
Yeah, and that's equally not as interesting to me as an adult who doesn't have time to do that.
Yeah, but I think also to support all that you're saying about Journey, you know, you came out of that feeling like you'd had an experience, but also it was a really resonant experience, right? It's not I just survived a 30-hour onslaught. It's I just came out of this and I feel changed and I'm going to reflect on this. And it does what amazing films do as well, right? Or amazing books, where it's not just, that was a great ride. It's, you know, I do feel changed. Like I look back on those hours and there's just a resonance that I think has really been a shift for games in the last, 5 years, I would say, and sort of where we think about what can real narrative do and that fusion do. It is leave you in a different emotional place.
Well, and to build on that, the thing that I find most fascinating to even like to take your point and run with it even more, when I talk to outsiders about Journey, I describe it like I do Shel Silverstein's work, and in particular, The Giving Tree. Because The Giving Tree is a book that you can read to someone as a kid. I could read it as a teenager. I could read it as a 20-year-old, a 30-year-old. I could read it today, and I could read it in 3 days. And almost every time I read it, I would gain something slightly different from it. On the experiences and what I'm feeling in my life, because it leaves that little bit open to interpretation and to yourself. Mm-hmm. And Journey does a magic trick where, for a long time, I would have people come over and I would play the game for them if they weren't good at video games, or I would sit down and force them to play it. And I've played that game, 24 times probably. And almost every time I play it, I take something slightly different from it based on where I am at in my life at the time. And you're right, the best do that, but it's much more rare for a film to be able to pull off that magic trick. And, and it much more feels akin to some, the brilliance of something like The Giving Tree that cracks some weird code in the human brain.
Yeah, I've often, made analogies, and look, this is after I'm working on kind of, pulp popcorn entertainment, because, you got to know your genre and know what the promise is. But that these games are like poems, right? In the same way, a poem leaves room for you as a collaborator with the author to kind of fill in the gaps through interpretation. That gives you interpretation is interactivity, right? In the same way that if you read some, airport novel, it's not like you're doing a lot of kind of thinking and interpretation. It's just consuming the words, right? Whereas something like Journey versus, and I'll even just use my own work as an example, versus an Uncharted, which is meant to be something a little bit more like an airport novel, right? Half of the interactive qualities is our interpretation of that event and how we internalize it. And this is true of things like Florence and Papers, Please, and, right? So these games that, have risen above the noise and been recognized for this quality tend to be these sort of smaller indie games. Or, Edith Finch is another example, right? So something I struggle with, and look, I think you probably think about this too, it's like a Kong is not that different than an Uncharted in the sense that we know what our contract with the audience is, right? There's a certain kind of thing you're trying to deliver. But we still want to try to deliver on, but we still want to deliver on that other thing, right? Meaning through, and certainly in the case of games, meaning through interaction. How is that interaction sort of tactile, tangible, and therefore emotional in a real way for the player that wouldn't be if they were just viewing it?
Yep. Well, and I think that kind of goes to almost what I would call like symphonic filmmaking, which, obviously is stuff like 2001, but even like, Akira is something that, the director, and this sort of starts getting into like, auteur theory a little bit, which I really genuinely believe that, yes, games are a collective medium and so many people put in, but film is too. Like, make no mistake, I will take an idea from a PA or an actor or like my assistant or whomever. Like, the best idea should win if you're a smart person. Like, you should have your blinders on to what you're trying to make, and you should also listen to the smart people around you, and then also at times channel those people the fuck out when you have to. But ideally they're great people that you want to listen to. But games just weren't afforded that same like that same like category or that same like sense of reverence early on that like they were able to call these people and people like yourselves auteurs. And auteur in film can even have a dirty word, but to me auteur just means, is there a true centralized idiosyncratic vision behind that? And I think that the best things in any medium is a true centralized idiosyncratic vision, because without that the other stuff can be made in a machine. But when you look at symphonic filmmaking, when you look at these things that really ebb and flow and take you on those journeys and leave room for interpretation, when you watch like the ballet of that is Akira, or 2001, like you are checking these boxes of like the big spectacle and all this stuff. But like, it's just, it is leaving a little bit more open. It is that less is more. What's the monster behind the corner is potentially scarier than the monster directly in front of you. And then you have modern examples like Bong Joon-ho's The Host, where he says, well, fuck all that logic. I'm going to put the monster right in front of you right in the first scene. And, I was doing a similar thing in Kong of like, I don't want to follow these rules of, okay, we're going to build and build and build and slowly tease up to this monster as we go. And then in the third act, boom, there he is. It's like, no, opening sequence. Here's your Kong. You're like, okay, now that's out of the bag. Let's go, and so part of it is about like learning when to like understanding the tropes well enough that we know when and how to subvert those expectations, to twist them, to contort them, so that we're checking all the boxes that you talked about. Kong is a piece of like cinematic history and pop culture. So there's certain things I have to do, right? Yeah. But what you have to understand what those things are. In the same way when adapting a game, what are those like musts? And if you're changing something, are you changing it for the right reason? And do you know why you're changing it? And do you know that's something that like you can change as a result, and by changing it, you actually may be making something stronger and better, and actually that taps more into the feeling of the game to begin with. And it's it's a treacherous slope.
But that is the analysis that we have to apply. I mean, that is the, otherwise, yes, you are just aping another medium, or you are just turning the crank. It is just a parts list as opposed to understanding the fundamental why behind what you're doing, and that takes work and research and analysis.
Yeah, and the good and bad news of that being, like, there is no template, there is no formula where you can say that was like friggin' spot on, like we're trying to figure it out right now, right? And you don't know which that chemical balance
makes it hard to defend sometimes upward, right? To executives or management to try to go, the conversation often has to be just like, trust me, I've got a gut instinct on this, and to get back to what you were saying, Jordan, I mean, if you think of durable films, that endure for us as being, iconoclastic and in their vision, well, that's the stuff that can get crushed by the machine, right? Because a lot of the decisions we make may seem crazy, nonsensical, right? Which is sometimes why the best stuff gets made under the radar. The first movie, the first game is often the easiest to do because nobody knows what the hell you're doing. And then when you go to the sequel, now you got a lot of stakeholders that have opinions about it.
You're doing it under the radar when no one's paying attention, or you're trying to, like, I always talk about it as like smuggling. It's like, and a lot of contemporary like blockbuster filmmaking is saying, okay, well, I have this IP, I have Kong, or I have whatever, and granted, I like, part of, when you say you started with Pong and I started with Kong, like that was real in the sense of like, granted, I wasn't watching the 1933 Kong out the gate, but I was growing up on Harryhausen and Jason and the Argonauts, and that was directly inspired and was so much a part of that lineage of visual effects. And so, yes, I have a love of monster movies and kaiju movies and Harryhausen, but to some degree, Kong is also like, well, yeah, I'm going to do this movie and make a great Kong movie. What can I smuggle in here that is part of another story that I want to tell? And a lot of, Hollywood is so obsessed with IP right now that a lot of directors are saying, oh, well, I'm going to sign into this movie that's about X. I don't know, Clifford the Big Red Dog or whatever the hell it is. And what crazy thing can I smuggle into that? That's this other story that I really want to tell that just happens to fall under this banner of this IP. And, and you have to do that intelligently where you're not like being disgraceful to the thing, but there are ways to truly smuggle that in and bring that idiosyncrasy. But you're right. The first time when it's under the radar, when people aren't paying attention, is generally how that stuff gets made.
Yes. Yes. And you think that would result, if it's successful, in people going, well, wow, we can sure trust your instincts because you nailed it. But no, that's not what happens. Next is like, all right, all right. Well, that was lucky, but so.
All right, let us get involved.
Guardrails on this thing. Exactly. Clearly, that's what's missing is your involvement. Yes. Yeah.
But that's also, I do think that the guardrails can be interesting. Like, I do a lot of commercials, and not just for launch campaigns, for, the Destiny 2s and the PUBGs and, a handful of video game things that haven't been announced. But I like doing commercials because my job as a director, sometimes I view myself as like some sort of weird filmmaking by definition. Filmmakers are like, it's like if we go into a Ford plant to shoot an auto commercial, literally us being there, we're like parasites. The amount of money for them to like stop the assembly line, for us to like go and set up a shot is like hundreds of thousands of dollars per second. Like we're violating every code, every regulation that they have, and so we're these SEAL Team 6 ninjas that get dropped in. And my job as a director sometimes is to be this like Tasmanian devil that you drop into this box and just sees how far I can push everything until somebody, hopefully it's someone that you trust. And a lot of the commercial people that I work with, a lot of these guys that an agency called Battery, they trust me enough to get to drop me in and know I'm going to push and push and push and push and see where I can push. And they say, okay, buddy, like
that's our job, right? Here. Yeah, constraints are great. Creativity without constraints is chaos. The question is when those constraints are coming from a lack of faith as opposed to realistic constraints that you need to be reminded about,
Or just a core lack of
understanding. That's a whole other topic.
Core lack of understanding being the worst of which. Also the most common generally. But, Kiki, you talked about but restraints in art and like you think about just simple things of like the entire reason Mario has a mustache is because they couldn't pick in the pixels really define a nose without it. Like you think about how classic Koji Kondo's like Donkey Kong and Mario and Zelda and Metroid scores are based on the simplicity and the lack of fidelity that they had into the simple notes and melodies that they had to reach. And I just like restraints in any medium. I very frequently find myself on set where I have all these storyboards. When we like for months before, I sat in a room and I boarded out a sequence. I shot listed things, and I had all these great ideas of transitions and this and that. And then a prop doesn't work, or you show up and you've run out of light, or an actor was late, and it's like, oh my God, I have 13 shots I needed to do. We lose the sun in 15 minutes, and I think my favorite things, and actually a lot of my favorite movies, are those moments where you're like, okay, well, how do I do this in 2 shots? And so you're forced to ask, what is the truth of what I'm trying to do? And you either you have to capture that magic in that moment, or you don't. And I think that's what separates like great creators from like fine creators, is like with the restraints, can you actually make something better as a result? And time and time again, video games and in movies, you see once those constraints are removed, once they have access to everything, the product suffers. You know, there's a million.
Well, as they say, it's the grit that makes the pearl, right?
Sorry to interrupt, guys. We are getting close to the end of the time of this slot. It's been amazing to listen to you. I have a crazy question though that I would like to ask you. We're watching concerts in Fortnite, right? It's like a thing, you know, like live events, live concerts in virtual places like Fortnite, the metaverse, all these things. Are we close to see also like a kind of a storytelling, you know, like kind of a movies, stories made for that kind of space? How do you see that future coming? Because I'm sure that someone is going to try to do something on that space really soon. Going a little bit more into the future. Do you think open worlds, metaverse could be like another complication to the storytellers, or it could be an opportunity as well to involve the players and even more?
Yeah, I mean, you go when you're advertising, which is what they're doing. You go where the audience is, right? Yeah. So, it's interesting because they also didn't they premiere the Tenet trailer there in Fortnite as well. I think Fortnite has done something really interesting in building sort of event-driven narrative for its players, which is something super different. And again, is sort of more narrative than it is straightforward story. So does that become a place for a story medium? I'm not so sure about that. You kind of have to look at what the audience expectation is for the kinds of entertainment they're looking for in that space, and the length of engagement and all of those things. Super interesting in terms of how you're able to mobilize an audience. But I think the idea, which frankly has probably been driven more by our current work from home quarantining experiences, what does it mean for people to virtually come together and share an experience together? And is that a place where you'll start to see different entertainment mediums starting to thrive differently, which they already are with co-viewing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the interesting flip side to that is who knows what happens with theaters, and obviously the theater was my church. I would go to the theater alone. But I do think that an interesting, strange thing has happened where Marvel has sort of co-opted what the contemporary comedy was. Sure, there's Girls Trip, but it's not like we've had a Bridesmaids or a Superbad or a Knocked Up or a comedy of that caliber in almost a decade plus. And I think part of that is the state of the world. I think part of that is idiosyncrasies where what?
I said Booksmart's pretty good. I would start to put Booksmart in there.
It's a great movie, but that's an indie that didn't cross over in the same way.
Right.
Booksmart's great, but I'm talking about like Knocked Up and Superbad and those movies were event movies where people wanted to cram in a space and laugh with a bunch of strangers. Now, Marvel has sort of taken, we're going to take all of the comedy and we're going to now give it to you in this action form, which is really smart and great because I love playing with tone and what Taika did with Ragnarok is brilliant. And, I love fusing tone like that. However, audiences now, and I don't know if this is about the state of the world or what, but audiences now are more willing and more agreeable to sit in a dark space and be scared together. They want to watch A Quiet Place or Invisible Man or Get Out, and they want, like, I think they're more fine being scared together because fear is fear, whereas comedy is idiosyncratic in personality, and we live in a time where it's like, well, I'd rather go watch my thing that speaks to my sense of humor, whereas like being afraid is being afraid. And somehow I think Fortnite and those shared experiences kind of bypass that, like, that sense of like us versus them, or do you share the same sense of humor? Here's a community that I belong to. Whereas I don't think people feel that same sense of kinship of like in the Alamo Draft House and certain like boutique theaters, certainly that's a community, but it's not like people as a whole are like, I want to go to my theater community and experience this with a bunch of people, you know?
I think there's an opportunity.
I honestly,
or there will be, I think, for this place to look less like an MMO and more like immersive theater writ large. And that's going to be the storyteller's challenge, right? And look, you can already look at something like Galaxy's Edge, at Disneyland. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to introduce immersive theater elements into a theme park experience. And that is our sort of shared story landscape. Those are the better models, I think, for us going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Taking like Sleep No More via Star Wars.
Yes,
Disney, right?
Sleep No More is great. Actually, I've been inviting Felix for quite a while. I should get him with you together next time. Thank you. We are running, unfortunately, out of time. It's been amazing. We could be, listening to you guys for hours and hours. Always a pleasure. Thanks for being with us today, and hopefully we can meet soon in person again in one amazing place and for real, a little bit closer. Thank you, Raúl, as well for helping us with the panel, and looking forward to seeing you again very soon.
Raúl, you're fine.
Despite but this is like this is the digital. I mean, we are not ready for the end of the world yet. I mean, we need to wait a little bit more. Okay, so
next time we meet, please, in a less laggy environment. In real life.
It's okay. We need to talk with the Spanish government to make those telecommunications better. Thank you, the four of you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for coming to Gamelab this year.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I rambled. I wish that the women above me are far more qualified to speak than I am. So
you're a good rambler. You're great to listen to.
It was amazing.
They are legitimate legends. I am simply trying to be as great as they are.
Okay.
Anyway, Amy, Kiki, Jordan, my apologies. I'm super embarrassed, but thank you for being able to...
Don't worry, Raúl. It was super fine.
Keanu Reeves told me once that if you stay quiet, the people think you are smarter. So
you were the smartest. It was great, Raúl, for sure. Thank you so much for your help. Thank you for your kind help putting this panel together. Talk to you soon.
All right.
Thank you, guys.
Enjoy.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.